introduce the speaker. So today, Fraser Rose will be speaking on programming and the indoctrination of children. He'll ask the audience to consider what programming and indoctrination, good or bad, they received from their family, their school environment, and the whole society they grew up in that influenced who they are now. Fraser Rose is a career educator and counseling specialist who has served many years as a principal in Ontario schools, both public and private, both elementary and secondary. During the time he was supervising principal of schools on the Canadian Forces Base in Trenton, he was elected to 4 terms of office as a trustee on the Hastings County Board of Education, and served as chairman of that board for 2 terms. For the past 20 years, he has been a high school principal in Toronto. So please join me in welcoming Fraser Rose.
Well, thank you very much, Lee, for that marvelous introduction. It's certainly better than the introduction I got the last time I spoke in front of an audience. The person introducing me said, this is Fraser Rose, the man who made $1 million last year. Well, he got that wrong. It wasn't me. It was my brother. And he didn't make it. He lost it. So you got your facts right, Lee, and I appreciate that. Talking about programming and indoctrination of children, I'll start with the most obvious case, one that you're all familiar with because of the news, the Taliban in Afghanistan. You know how they treat women. And if you ask yourself the question, how could they get that way to think women are must be so subservient to them? Because right now the Taliban are advocating that the women in Afghanistan must cover up their faces and wear their burqa, which means that they'll be covered from head to toe, except for their eyes, so they can see. Now, the only way that they got that way is because they were programmed, indoctrinated as young children, that this was the way to act, that this was their religion, that this was their custom, that this was the way things must be for the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that seems to be pretty obvious. And I'm starting with the most obvious case that I know of indoctrination and programming of children. Now, it's had very unfortunate results, of course, because now that the Taliban are in control of the government in Afghanistan, the economy has no cash to pay salaries or to buy food. Water is hard to get. And Western aid has been suspended because there are still many in the Taliban that are considered terrorists. Millions of Afghans will face malnutrition and starvation in the coming months because the Taliban, although they won militarily against their own government, even when it was aided by the United States, they don't know how to run a country because they haven't had experience doing that, and they haven't got the education to do that. Many of them can't read or write because they don't value education. Not part of their programming, not part of their indoctrination when they were very young. It's a sad situation, and millions of Afghans are and have suffered because of it. And especially women, of course, because now girls can only go to school until they're in grade 6. After that, education is forbidden. So gender-based violence is bad in Afghanistan, but it's also rising in other parts of the world, like Somalia and Kenya and Ethiopia, particularly for women-headed households and adolescent girls. Families have stopped sending girls to school, and child marriage is on the rise. We can't, as Canadians, gloat because our history, if we go back to the Victoria time, shows that women were always discriminated against. As you know, this Monday is going to be a holiday. And for those in the States, it's a holiday because it's Queen Victoria's birthday. Actually, it's her birthday's on the next day, the 24th, but it's always celebrated as a long weekend. But during the Victorian age, when Queen Victoria was ruling, women rarely ever had the chance to attend university. And if they got an education at all, they were forced to educate themselves. And some did, but it was difficult. So we can rejoice now that we're living in an era in North America where women have equal rights legally, but there's still sometimes a prejudice, a programming, and an indoctrination that has taken place when they were young that makes sometimes men feel superior to women and will not accept them as equals. Here's what one woman said at work. She said, "Some men think women couldn't possibly understand complicated paperwork. I once created a spreadsheet for work that made taking inventory less complicated and lessen the margin of error. The first time we used it for our physical inventory, one of the finance guys sat there and looked at the spreadsheet, and he was trying to explain it, the whole process to the other workers. And then he was completely wrong in what he was saying. And finally, I smiled at him and I said, "Well, thank you for explaining the process that I created. Now let me tell you how to do it properly." He then went to my boss to find out if it was true. And the boss said, "Yep, you're damn right. She did it all." And the guy who was the financial man in the company avoided her for the rest of the day. Just couldn't believe that a woman had accomplished that. And here's the story that a woman told as she was starting a new job at a new hospital. She happened to be a Black woman. She pulled into the lot and she parked in a spot reserved for physicians. I was a bit early, and I was laughing and chatting with my best friend on the phone when I hear an angry knock on my window. I turn to see a white man in his late 50s or early 60s with his face twisted in anger. I rolled down my window and he began shouting, "You can't park here. This is for physicians only." So I grabbed my badge. It's on a stretch string, and I place it in front of his face and I say, "I think this gives me permission to park here, dude." He didn't apologize. He just turned on his heels and walked away. She, of course, was a doctor. He rudely interrupted her call. He frightened her, and he was wrong in his assumption. Only because she was Black and because she was a woman, he assumed that she shouldn't be parking there, and he didn't apologize. So we can see his programming, his frame of thinking that women, especially Black women, are not equal to white people, especially doctors. And we sometimes hear how doctors in hospitals treat nurses. Many of them are wonderful, of course, but I have heard nurses complain that some doctors, just a few, treat nurses very badly just because they consider themselves superior to the nurses. Here's a story written by a woman, a PhD. She said, I was working for the government as a soil tester, a geotechnical engineer. I was basically crawling around in the dirt, retrieving soil and geological samples for a variety of different purposes. I'd been called out to a construction site of a newly developed shopping mall. Some very serious issues had propped up in the past few months, and the mall was open a big stink about dangerous levels of methane gas. And the agency I was working for at the time was tasked to do research. I was alone at the time. My co-workers had gone over to check on another site across the way. It was a warm day, and we'd been working for several hours. I was sweaty. My hair was in a messy bun. I was wearing dirty coveralls over my dress clothes. I looked like a hardworking person, maybe a maintenance, construction, or landscaping worker. I was working intently on test tubes and equipment laid out nearly all around me when I suddenly felt eyes looking at me. I looked around and saw a group of silhouettes, 4 people, standing just a few feet away. I was about to ask them to leave when I heard a woman's voice say in the most condescending tone, "Take a look at this person, Peyton. Take a good look, because this is what's going to happen to you if you don't stay in school and get good marks." They all kind of snickered when the woman spoke again, barking, "Peyton, Alexis, Jackson, stand over here so I can take your photo. We're posting this on the fridge to remind Peyton what her future will look like if she keeps screwing around with her education." The kids, all older teenagers, about 17 or 18 or 19, mumbled and shuffled around, but they obeyed. By this time, I had stood up and was reaching inside of my coverall to retrieve my credentials. At the same time, I could see that the others, that my fellow workers had returned from lunch and were starting to head toward us. I said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave this area immediately. You are trespassing on a secured area. It's not only illegal for you to be here, it's unsafe." She looked at me incredulously with the most smug smirk expression that I've ever seen, and responded, "Excuse me? You obviously have no idea who I am. My husband owns this property, honey, and I'm certainly not going to take orders from someone whose job it is to scrounge around in the dirt. What's your name? You're going to regret this little interaction when you're sitting in the unemployment office, because I'll have my husband fire you." At this point, I flipped open my badge and shoved it toward her so she could clearly see my credentials, which included the word doctor, along with some official government gibberish and symbols. Her face comically went from confused to concern in about 5 seconds. I called out to my armed military security personnel and said, "Gentlemen, if you wouldn't mind, this woman is trespassing in a secured area and refusing to leave. Could you please convince her and her family to comply with my lawful order to end her trespass and explain the consequences of not doing so? And they replied, absolutely, Dr. Smith, moving quickly towards the woman and towards the teens. She began stammering that she didn't know and to call her husband, and he'll explain, and saying that you're making a big deal out of nothing, all the while they were guiding her by her elbows, steering her away from the area. Her kids were telling her to calm down and stop the fuss, but she continued to argue. And then she became belligerent and uncooperative, so local law enforcement was called to aid in arresting her. So you can see the mindset that mother had, and was trying to convince her kids that anybody who worked in dirt obviously was at a lower level than they were in the family. So that's the programming that she had received. And we all know the programming in indoctrination that happened in the Deep South back at the time of slavery, back in the 1850s and 60s, and that led to the Civil War. And we are also aware that some of that programming and indoctrination continues to exist, as Black people are often discriminated against because of their color. And the same is true of people who are LGBT. They've been discriminated against for ages and ages, and in many countries they still are. As a matter of fact, it's illegal. They can go to jail for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. Thankfully, we're ahead of all that in Toronto. At least most of us are, and we haven't been programmed. Although our grandparents were, to think that is wrong, to have a sexual identity different than the norm. Here's a story written by a policeman. He said, we got a domestic call, and when we got there, the wife was in bad shape. Her eyes were nearly shut, and her face was badly beaten. She had taken some severe blows. Yet, as we were trying to cuff the husband, she comes at us with a frying pan. She's protecting him, and she said, he loves me, and it was my fault. I should have been a better wife. At that point, I had the urge to take the frying pan from her and hit her over the head with it. The one thing kept going over and over in my mind was, seriously, lady, what is your problem? This man nearly killed you. She would not press charges. Crazy people, end of quote. No, she wasn't crazy. She'd been programmed, indoctrinated as a child that she was unworthy of a good husband. And she felt that he had the right to do with her as he wanted, because she had been an unworthy wife and hadn't lived up to his expectations. And so her programming nearly got her killed by her husband, but she refused to press charges. You've read about cases like this, and none of what I've said so far will surprise you, I don't think. Just a couple of days ago in the Star, a man was saying that he was coming out of the grocery store, went to his car, which was in the parking lot, and there was a woman there who was hysterical. She had 3 small children, and she was screaming at them. And she was fumbling around. She couldn't find her keys, her car keys. She was looking in her handbag. She was looking in her pockets. She was looking all over the place for her car keys and couldn't find them. And all the time she was screaming at these little kids, maybe 2, 4, and 6 years old. She had just lost it. And so he couldn't drive out because he couldn't open, her car was so close to his that he couldn't open his door without hitting it. So he just stood there. And he wondered if he should intervene somehow. But all his life, he had believed and been taught, never interfere in what's not your business. Don't meddle yourself in affairs that aren't yours. And so he didn't say anything. He just stood there for about 10 minutes, and she's continuing to rant and rave and yelled at the kids who were crying. And then finally, a young couple, a man and woman, came up and they said, "Can we be of help?" And the woman stopped screaming and just kind of broke down sobbing and says that, "I can't find my keys. I can't find my keys." And she was just so stressed out that she was making this rest. So anyway, they helped her, and they actually found her keys for her in the bottom of her handbag, and she thanked them, and the kids got in the car and drove away. But the man thought to himself later, should I have done something? And what should I have done? And why do I always never interfere? Why am I always passive? And why didn't I go up and say something like, "May I be of help?" But he didn't. And he wrote a letter in the Star to Ellie, who's an advisor, to ask her if he was wrong in not interfering. So the cases that I have talked about so far, you're all familiar with discrimination and with what I've been talking about. And I suspect that none of you suffer from that kind of programming or indoctrination, or you wouldn't be here as part of this group. I suspect you're clear of that. I think I am too, because I wasn't programmed or indoctrinated to dislike or hate or have prejudice against anybody, and that the right thing to do is to love everybody. So I'll tell you a different way that you might have been programmed or indoctrinated that maybe you're not even aware of. Do you have an upper limit that isn't really your upper limit? Do you are you afraid of achieving more, too much, because you don't deserve it, because you're flawed in some way? Understanding, many people are, understanding why we've limited ourselves liberates a new energy in us, which we can draw on to propel us to new heights of abundance and love and creativity. As we spiral upward in our quest to express our unique genius, we will likely soar past ghosts and shadows of old barriers. And for this reason, it's best to think of our quest as a continuing journey of transcending upper limits. The payoff for the work is a gift of enduring value. We get to live in the full rainbow of our potential in our zone of genius. In that exalted space, we enjoy the love, abundance, and success we create, and our very presence inspires people whenever we go in the world. We transcend our upper limit every time that we make more room inside to feel love and abundance and success. So some of us have this upper limit problem, and it's a human tendency to sabotage ourselves when we exceed the artificial upper limit that we have placed on ourselves. The upper limit problem is caused by a too low thermostat, the setting of the thermostat in our ability to achieve and enjoy ultimate success. The thermostat gets set low early in our lives when we're quite young, at a time when we could not think for ourselves. And later, as we dream about big goals, and those you young people who are listening, I hope that you dream about big goals, and you move up into realms of love, abundance, and creativity. But if you have something in your background, maybe even in your subconscious that you're not aware of, about a thermostat setting that says you can only go so far, and then you bump up against the artificial lid that was placed on your success through unconscious childhood decisions, unless you solve the upper limit problem, you keep finding ways to bring yourself back down when we've blown past your old setting. The childhood decisions all were made unconsciously as you navigated through difficult family cross currents. And those unconscious decisions become barriers that we must overcome in order to express and enjoy our full measure of success. It's called cognitive dissonance. You get to, maybe you've succeeded at accomplishing a lot. Maybe you're very successful, but maybe that's an artificial height, and maybe you could do a lot more. But if your thermostat is set so that you're afraid to go higher because you think maybe you're not worthy of even more, then you may unconsciously sabotage yourself so that you don't go higher than this artificial thermostat setting that you've set for yourself. Cognitive dissonance means that you're under some stress if you try to exceed it. And so you may sabotage yourself so that you don't succeed it. You may get sick, or you may do something else that will prevent you from reaching your real, genuine, genius upper limit. So be aware of that, because it does happen to people sometimes who are already very successful, and but never quite achieve quite as much as they could, because they have been unconsciously programmed or indoctrinated as a child that there's only so much you can do, only so far you can go. But sometimes that's an artificial limit. And and I think perhaps we're all more capable than we understand ourselves to be, and could achieve even more if we can avoid that artificial thermostat setting. Thank you.